It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about this topic that many individuals fail to address, and that is men's mental health. So when we think of mental health, oftentimes we're looking at just people in general. Well, here we have a specialty which is catering to men. So as you can see here, man, the impregnator, the protector, the provider, this often creates a lot of stress and pressure for men, which leads to mental health issues, and we will talk about that as we go. So I want to start off with a very, very awesome website called mantherapy.org. It's a wonderful website which caters to men. They have a 24-hour crisis hotline for men to where they can call and they can get them help to where they don't feel shame or embarrassment to call and talk about feelings or things that may be bothering them. The beautiful thing about mantherapy.org is that it engages a lot of humor. There's a lot of humor involved, and a lot of that has to do with bringing down the sort of guard that may be there for men when they are seeking treatment. So I'm going to play a little segment of mantherapy.org so you can get familiar with Dr. Mahogany and what he has to offer.
Greetings, friends. I'm Dr. Rich Mahogany. With the help of Cactus, a ad agency, I created a man's mental health campaign called Man Therapy. So open your ear holes. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. As you know, guys talk about a lot of things. They talk about sex, sports, beer, food, cars, and booze. But they don't talk or even think about their mental health. And with an alarming suicide rate among working-age men, this needed a change. Unfortunately, men just weren't responding to the typical head and hands, wife-consoling husband PSAs of the past. Men respond to humor, to honest discussion, and to facts. So I decided to create something very different to get men talking, thinking, and in some cases, fixing their mental health. The campaign centered on me, a stereotypical manly man, who also happens to be a pretend therapist, with the personality that is part doctor, part football coach, part drinking buddy, and 100% action hero. I would show men that taking care of their mental health is the manliest thing a man can do. To bring me to life, I created mantherapy.org. Set in my office, the website combines humor with science, facts, empowering resources, inspiring testimonials, and a self-diagnostic tool called the 18-point head inspection. To encourage visitors, I created a PSA. Men have a way of doing things. A man has his way of eating, of exercising, of keeping his hands warm, and of straightening up. Online web videos. Yoga isn't just for yuppies anymore. Banner ads, billboards, posters, and bus shelter ads. I even wrote manly mental health prescriptions and gave them to guys at bars. And although I'm usually not one to brag, I'm going to go ahead and brag. The campaign and website received a ton of visitors. Generated massive discussion on social media, got press in some of America's biggest news outlets, and had a positive effect on men across the country. And to think, not long ago, I was just a sketch in a fancy notebook. I hope you enjoy Man Therapy. Me? I'm going to eat 6 hot dogs.
So the important piece to know is that Resources are limited that specifically cater to men. And when we think about that, oftentimes many clinicians will say, well, we do take into account men and them coming to therapy, but really, do you understand the underlying issues or where these issues are coming from? So men's mental health is actually known as the silent crisis or silent suffering. And at least 6 million men suffer from depression every year. But the scary part is that men are almost 4 times more likely to complete suicide. Why? Because they tend to not be able to, or they're socialized not to express their feelings, not to go and get help, but to man up essentially. And so this is very scary for men. So what I usually do when I do these trainings is I ask you to look at this picture and say, what do you see? And many people will say pain, suffering, sadness. Many people rarely see men cry. And when they do, it's often one-on-one. So you don't see this a lot because it's been socialized to be not okay. And we need to show as clinicians and others that it's okay for men to express their feelings. Now, where does all this come from? I like to talk about the masculine identity model. And masculine identity is pretty much the masculine sense of self. And what does that mean? It means a need for power, a need for authority, this increased tendency to enact aggressive behavior and be within the norm. So it's very much the norm for boys, for men, to engage in aggressive behavior, to be parts of aggressive sports. If you look at the sports out there, football, specifically hockey, very aggressive sports. You don't see a lot of these in women. The other model that I like to talk about is the gender role stress model. And what this says is stress or trauma essentially comes from the rigid adherence to the male role. So what does this lead to? It leads to increased aggression, emotional lability, so that sort of happy turn to sad real quick, or angry turn to happy, that real emotional lability. Decreased self-esteem, negative attitudes towards women, sexual prejudice, depression, suicide, high-risk behaviors such as substance abuse and dependence. And so, knowing this, we know that this rigid adherence to the male role and what they are socialized to be essentially can lead to this trauma. And this is how they address trauma. So how is it different? Men's symptoms tend to be, there's a lot of overlap, but where you will see depressive symptoms are very much in physical terms. So it's not in the emotional sort of way that many women experience it, but more in a physical way, which makes sense. Fatigue, headaches, difficulty with sleeping, decreased sex drive, decreased work production, physical pain such as the back and the neck. The scary part is that men tend to use alcohol and drugs to address these symptoms, to address the fatigue, the headache, the decreased sex drive, the poor sleep, 4 to 6 times more than women by using drugs and alcohol. So they will address these by using drugs and alcohol. 4 to 6 times more than women. I like to ask people what they see here. And yes, this is a video from a camp. However, boys are raised around guns. Boys are raised around aggression. Boys are raised around rough and tumble play. And what this may look like fun to kids really is exposure to trauma from a very young age. However, boys are socialized that this is okay. It's okay for boys to play with guns. That's what they're supposed to do, or to fight, or to be aggressive. But that really has a experience of trauma for many kids and men later on in life, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The interesting statistic that I want to bring up now, moving into some of the statistics, is unwanted direct sexual contact. It used to be where movies would display the babysitter, the female babysitter, you know, the 17-year-old babysitter female who would seduce essentially the 12 or 13-year-old boy to show him the way, and that was cool, and that was something that boys should look for. But the problem is that up to 1 of 6 men report having had unwanted direct sexual contact with an older person by the age 16. 1 of 6 have had this experience, but we don't hear about it. Why? Because they're socialized to think, all right, men, boys, sex, this is the norm. But if it was a female, that's what we see. And so unwanted direct sexual contact is happening to our boys every day, 1 out of 6. If we include non-contact sexual behavior, such as someone exposing him or her to a child, him or herself to a child or boy, up to 1 in 4 men report boyhood sexual victimization. I remember not too long ago being in the gym showers and coming out and seeing this boy. He was probably around the age of 9, sitting there looking very traumatized, just very, very, you know, his face covered almost with embarrassment and shame because his mother had brought him into the shower area. What that's about, not sure, multiple things, but that is exposure, and many people don't understand that. So looking at more statistics, a smaller portion of sexually abused boys than sexually abused girls report sexual abuse to authorities, and this is what I was talking about earlier. The vast majority, over 80% of sexually abused boys, never become adult perpetrators. Many people think that these kids, if they were abused, will become perpetrators, but 80% of them, over that, will not. However, up to 80% of the perpetrators that are perpetrators were themselves, they were abused. So it doesn't lead to it, but those who are perpetrators have been abused themselves. So this is very, very significant in treatment of not only survivors, but perpetrators, or individual men in general with various issues they may have. On average, boys first experience sexual abuse at age 10. Now, the age range, and this is research, the age range at which boys are first abused is from infancy to late adolescence. Infancy. We see that out there. We do see infancy. And that's sad. But from infancy to late adolescence, these individuals, these boys are first abused. Now, research also shows that boys are at greater risk for sexual abuse if they're living with neither or only one parent, those whose parents are separated, divorced, and or remarried, and those whose parents abuse alcohol or involved in drugs, criminal behavior, or are disabled. So these are some of the factors that research shows that are correlated to boys' abuse, sexual abuse. So boys are most commonly abused by males. Between 50 and 75% are males. However, it's important to note that these boys, these males that are abusing these boys, are often identified as heterosexual. So it's not gay men who are doing this, but it's most often males who are heterosexual that are abusing these boys. Now, some more statistics. Boys often feel physical sexual arousal during abuse, even if they are repulsed by what is happening. We see this with girls too. Because of the biological mechanism, there are some things that are just, when touched or hit correctly, there's going to be a physically arousing piece to it that needs to not be taken into account, because of the fact that because they experience physical sexual arousal does not mean that it wasn't abuse. Abuse is anything unwanted, and we need to start looking at boys. Again, perpetrators tend to be males who consider themselves heterosexual and are most likely to be known but unrelated to the victim. So moving on, I want to talk about the traditional male code. So Levant studied traditional male code. He came up with this model. And what he says is that there are historical rules or standards about the socially approved ways of being male. And this is where males have difficulty with mental health issues, because they need to behave in a certain way. This is how males should behave. And Levant talks about those core elements of men and behavior, such as aggressiveness, the fight to be non-feminine, because being feminine or engaging in feminine activities, one, is shame, embarrassment. They don't want to be seen as gay, right? Self-reliant, toughness, and status, power. And these core elements, men live up, boys live up to this. This is how they should behave. This is how society has shaped them. So Levant's traditional male code, very important to understanding men's mental health. So he talks about different individuals, and we're going to go over several that Levant talks about. The first one is the rugged individual. And the rugged individual is where men should, again, remember hearing the shoulds and the coulds, men should be emotionally stoic. They must hide that inner life that they have. They should be tough and deny their pain, so suck it up, man up. They should be independent and self-reliant. These are our rugged individuals, our tough and rugged we hear oftentimes. The big man. So the big man should be preoccupied with status, work, achievement, conquest, and success. They should be number one, the boss. They should be competent and never fail. They should maintain power and control, especially over women who are supposed to be inferior. They should be sexually magnificent and are sexually eager by nature. They should not be victims. So hopefully at this point, starting to hear this traditional male code, you hear how men's mental health and some of these issues about how they're socialized relate to many of these issues that you will see in treatment. Give them hell. This is where it says that men should be active, they should be forceful, they should be aggressive, they should be fearless. They should see life as competition or a competitive battlefield. They should be physically strong. And the big thing here is winning isn't the main thing, it's the only thing. You are to win. No sissy stuff. So men should reject everything traditionally associated with femininity, including being vulnerable, expressing emotion, any type of dependency, being passive, and intimate conversation. Sex should purely be a physical act, not an emotional one, not a relational one, and not a spiritual one. And men should especially reject homosexuality. So, no sissy stuff, another traditional male code. So moving on to trauma, really important to be able to link this to trauma. So trauma strain is a term that looks at traumatic events that are expressed or express by males in the normal process of male socialization. So if you think of normal male socialization, which I talked about earlier, there is trauma, there are traumatic effects within the moment that these kids pick up a weapon, right? Toy guns even. But then they start getting older and they start shooting arrows or going to the gun ranges or being around weapons and machinery and all of these things. And within that, there's trauma. Fighting is okay. That's a masculine thing to do. Boys fight, right? That makes you a man, to beat up someone, to stand in front of somebody and kick them down. There's trauma in that. So I want you to think of this definition. And could we say that suicidal ideation is trauma? That many of these things lead to suicidal ideation, and within that, that is trauma. Because if you cannot live up to be this traditional male code, which I talked about, many men, and this is where the suicide rates are 4 times more than women, because they can't live up to the traditional male code. They cannot live up or stand up to the way that they're supposed to be. And suicidal ideation itself can be seen as trauma. So when we mention trauma, it's important to understand the different types of trauma. The first that I want to talk about is male-specific traumas. Okay? So there are very specific traumas that Bronstein, Levant, Pollock in the 80s, 90s have researched that are specific to male. And the first one, which is really interesting, trauma 1, begins at birth through childhood. And what these 3 researchers found is that parents, peers, actively discourage male infants and children from expressing vulnerable or caring emotions through a process, such as, if the child cries, they're shamed, you're weak, boys don't cry. Or there's a tendency to where, if you have a baby girl and a baby boy, if the baby girl cries, they're actively, by parents and peers, addressed. Oh, you're going to be okay, it's okay. When boys cry, or infant boys cry, they tend to ignored. So they walk away, parents, peers, everybody walks away and just lets them be. Because they're showing them that that's not okay by ignoring or shaming. Again, boys don't cry is saying cut you off from your emotions. And that goal is to decrease femininity. Haviland and Malatesta in 1981, they did some interesting research. And what they said is actually male infants are more emotionally expressive in general during infancy and early childhood than females. But they're ignored. Levant in 1998 talked about alexithymia, and where there's difficulty putting words into emotions. And so these things impact boys, males. The second trauma, known as trauma 2, is very interesting. Pollock did some interesting research on this. And this has to do with early separation of boys from their mothers. And he calls it the traumatic abrogation of the early holding environment. And that boys develop a sense of loss, abandonment due to forced independence. So that goes back to what I was talking about how when boys cry or infants cry that are males, that they're ignored. And so immediately these boys are grieving. There's a sense of loss. There's a grieving. They feel abandoned because they're forced to be independent. They're forced to shut off their emotions. Very interesting. And I definitely can see that. Trauma 3 is pervasive violence within male culture. And again, I talked about this a little bit with some of the examples I gave you earlier, which is 50% of boys have experienced some form of violent victimization. 50%. 1 out of 2 boys have experienced some form of violent victimization. This is via physical fights, degradation with sports. So kids who go out there, they don't do well in sports, and they're called a loser. They're made fun of. Guns, extreme sports. Think about that. You see boys and men getting involved in these extreme sports, snowboarding from tops of high mountains. Think of all those extreme sports and think about how many women do you see in those and how many men. And the military. Trauma, violent victimization. So there are some theories that were developed by Gilmore in 1990. And Gilmore talked about cultural delusions and abuse as it relates to men. And these are important to know. And they may sound obvious to us. But for many people, this is the reality. And we're clinicians, so we learn a lot of this stuff. But for many people out there, this is the reality. So cultural delusions, according to Gilmore, act to amplify an individual's trauma, limit the services available, and block the healing process. So these things can sometimes get in the way of providing services to our men and blocking that healing process. So Gilmore's first cultural delusion is males cannot be sexually abused or victimized. And yes, they can. And we don't have accurate statistics or numbers because they don't come forward, because they're socialized to think, I should take up these sexual advances. I should really focus on them. I'm supposed to be this sexual being. Cultural delusion 2. If a male has allowed abuse, then he's a sissy. So if he has allowed himself now to be sexually abused or to be abused, then he's a sissy. Why couldn't he stand up for himself? Why couldn't he be a man? That's cultural delusion number 2. Cultural delusion number 3. Males can always say no to abuse if violence is not used. No, this is a delusion. They can't always. Cultural delusion 4. If a male becomes sexually aroused, then he is equally participating in abuse, which is something I talked about earlier. Absolutely not. Cultural delusion 5. Most sexual abuse of males is perpetrated by gay men, and I talked about that earlier, and it's not. Cultural delusion 6. Sexual abuse turns a boy gay. Absolutely not. Can it lead to confusion? Yes. Because sometimes, and this is for females as well, sometimes when there's same-sex abuse, sexual abuse, and there's physiological arousal, a boy or a girl looking at that same-sex abuser may say, could I be gay? Could I be a lesbian? Could I be bisexual because I was physiologically aroused? But it's a cultural delusion that it turns it for sure. Cultural delusion number 7. Sexually abused boys inevitably become sexually abusive men. And we talked about the statistics earlier. Over 80% do not. But of those that are perpetrators in adulthood, 80% have been. Cultural delusion number 8, males are less traumatized by sexual victimization than women. Absolutely not. They just express it in a different way. Cultural delusion number 9, perpetration by females is rare. Absolutely not. We are seeing more and more females come out in the news, come out in the media that are perpetrators against both males and females. So it is not rare. It's just not either reported or seen. Cultural delusion 10. Perpetration by a female is less harmful. The boy is lucky if this happens because it means they're having heterosexual experiences or sexual experiences in general. This is definitely a cultural delusion that many kids see because they're socialized this way. So I want to talk more about sexual abuse. How do you know it? How do you see some of those symptoms? Some of it could be decreased masculinity. Some of it could be hypermasculinity, so it could go either way. And I want you to think about this after the training and even watch this again, because you do have more time to watch this again and to experience this training again. Think about, how else do you see symptoms of sexual abuse? Could be sexual withdrawal, triggers during sex, any type of foreplay. Much of it can be seen that way. And if a man is seen as not being a sexual being, that in itself demasculates them. But that could be a symptom of sexual abuse. Doesn't mean they have been. It could be a symptom, though. So think about that. Many people don't know that male breast cancer exists. I know 3 men who are survivors of male breast cancer. And so many times when we're linking health and mental health, we don't see these male breast cancer cases. Why? Because think about what everything I've talked about so far and what it would be like for a man to have breast cancer, when the goal from infancy on is to decrease femininity, and yet they end up with what's seen as a female disease. So I urge you to go to malebreastcancer.org and look at the statistics. Look at what's out there. It is out there and it's prevalent. But the fact that men are socialized to not show emotion, to not seek therapy, and to be hit with something that they really need treatment, both physical and psychological, you're not seeing them. And we need to open that up more. So I urge you to go to malebreastcancer.org. So I want to tell you a little bit about male breast cancer. In 2013, there will be an estimated, well, this is previous statistics, but in 2013, there will be an estimated 2,240 new cases of male breast cancer diagnosed. Estimated 410 men will die of the disease in the U.S. Breast cancer is 100 times more common in women than men. So about 1 in 1,000 men will be diagnosed with breast cancer in a lifetime. That is a lot more than what people suspect. 1 in 1,000. Think of the state of California alone and how many people live here, and every 1 in 1,000 men will be diagnosed with breast cancer in their lifetime. Survival rates are approximately the same. And 1 out of 5 men diagnosed with breast cancer will have a family member who will have breast cancer. So if your father, your uncle, whoever it may be, has had breast cancer, or you yourself, your children, your family members need to be looked at, both men and women. 1 out of 5 men will have a family member who will have breast cancer, so you have to screen. We need to empower men to be screened, just like women. Risk factors. So what are the risk factors for male breast cancer? Men between the age of 60 and 70. Men who have been treated with radiation around the chest area. Men with close blood relatives who have breast cancer. Males with higher levels of estrogen, such as you see in Klinefelters. Men who are heavy drinkers due to high liver toxicity, which can cause higher estrogen levels. So we have to be very careful. Andropause is another term I want to talk about relating to men's mental health. So many people don't understand that females go through menopause and males go through something very similar, which is called andropause. So this is aging-related hormone changes or hormone changes in men. So what have we heard this as? Male menopause. We've heard it as testosterone deficiency. We've heard it as androgen deficiency and late onset hypogonadism. This is male menopause. This is the version of menopause that is men's andropause. I would highly be sensitive to saying male menopause because that puts a negative stigma on it, but andropause is the best terminology. And so when we look at the biological aspects, testosterone levels declines as one ages. Approximately after the age of 30, for each year after, they lose 1%. 1% per year after the age of 30, they're losing or their testosterone levels are declining. By the age of 70, the decrease can possibly decline to about 50%. So physiologically, they're going through andropause. They're experiencing the same thing that women experience with menopause. So how do we recognize this? How might we see this? Decreased or diminished sex drive or functioning, erectile disorder, delayed ejaculation disorder, infertility, fewer spontaneous erections, gynecomastia, which is tender or swollen breasts, hair loss, decreased self-confidence or motivation, depression, difficulty concentrating, and mood lability. So as clinicians, this is why DSM had that Axis 3. We need to look at medical things that could be affecting mental health to where a man or men are presenting with these concerns, which are huge issues. Erectile disorder, delayed ejaculation disorder, huge, depression. And it could be physiologically driven. We need to address it. Eating disorders. So many individuals do not take into account that men comprise quite a big portion of the population. 10 to 15% of the eating disorder population are men. Specifically, excuse me, anorexia and bulimia. Men are less likely to seek treatment due to the perception that this is a woman's disease. It's the same thing as male breast cancer. Among gay men, nearly 14% appear to suffer from bulimia. Over 20% of the gay men appear to have anorexia. So we need to be looking out for our gay men and these eating disorders. I'm not going to show you this video because it's quite long, and I usually do this training over 2 to 3 hours, but there's a really good intervention on A&E. You could actually go onto iTunes and get it. Actually, it might now be available on, if you Google search Andrew, eating disorder intervention. And you could watch this video, and it shows you a real-life case of a male that has an eating disorder. And it's scary. It's scary. So I really encourage you to watch this video on your own. Google Andrew, eating disorder intervention, and I believe it was from February 2014. And you should be able to watch this video, the full length. It's an hour. So I'm very sorry about this. I want to talk about treatment. The unfortunate circumstance is that there's not a lot of mental health treatment out there, centers or people that advertise as those who specify in working with men. When I originally got very passionate about this topic in 2011, when I did a research scan to find out what's out there for men, I got the Men's Project in Canada. That was the first thing that came up. Very limited services that work or cater to men and understanding men's mental health. So there's this YouTube video you can watch where you have the actual right here on the screen, and again you could see this for the next, I think she said 3 days. You can re-watch this and watch that video. And also go to the mensproject.ca and mantherapy.org. These are the biggest resources that you will find out there, unfortunately. I've partnered, me personally, I've partnered with Man Therapy because they're out of state. There's 2 states, but anybody from any state can call in and get support, but it's only publicized in those states a lot of the time. We don't see a lot of it out in other states. So I'm working with them to bring Man Therapy to California so that we can have this resource. So now that we've hit it's 11:47, I want to open it up to questions at this point that you may have.
Thank you so much, Dr. DeFeo, for this wonderful and informative presentation. I learned a lot personally. So if you do have any questions, go ahead and type them into the questions chat, and I will ask them to Dr. DeFeo for you. I do have a question, if you want to.
Okay.
Sorry, answer it before you hit play. So the question that came in is asking if you recommend any books on men's mental health.
Yes, I actually have a list. I should have had them available. I didn't even think of that. What I would suggest is do me a favor and send me an email, and I will send you that book list because I have several of them. And then I'll type in my email right now onto the chat so people have that.
Unmuted.
Okay, great. Oh, I think I see another question. Okay, so I have a couple of questions. So we have the question about the books. I have a question on, is there any difference in sympathetic sorry, I don't know if I can read that word. I want to say sympathology in anorexia or bulimia in male or female patients.
That's a really symptomology.
Yes, there we go.
Yeah. No. We see it the same exact way as you do in females. So the same symptoms, the same criteria, you'll see that. And when I show you this video, they actually give a misdiagnosis, which is interesting because if you watch the whole video of Andrew, you'll see that the diagnosis is really anorexia with binge eating purging type, according to DSM-4, but they say bulimia. But you can see that he is definitely below the cutoff of the body weight. So you will see the same thing, and I'm going to show this brief video since we do have a little bit of time left so that you can see that. But that's a very good question.
Okay, I do have a couple of more questions if we want to answer those before the video. So Armando asks if we can talk about the 3-hour training a little bit, and if you do that at maybe any other locations.
Yes, I actually have. Ooh, I can hear myself. I actually do them. I don't have any scheduled right now, but it's something I am working on to do in the near future. So one of the things I can tell you all is if you're interested in any sort of trainings and things like that, go to my website. It's and I just sent out an email or my website address, but it's Jennifer, JENNIFER, DeFeo, D as in David, E, F as in Frank, EO, PhD.com. And I usually keep an updated list of trainings that I'm doing in the community and various trainings that I may do. And I can notify you in the instance that I am. So check out my website because, again, I do have trainings listed. And also, you can email me at jennifer@jenniferdefeophd.com. So I know that they just sent out my email as well as you can see the web address. Oh, let me write in my web address. And then he will send it out to you.
Okay, so you might hear an echo again because I'm back unmuted. I have one more question from Gladys, who actually is working at our adolescent facility in San Diego. But she's asking, her question is, I will be working with adolescents, and I assume boys will be experiencing these kinds of issues. What kind of approach can clinicians take during this developmental period? How do we diminish these cultural delusions?
That's a really good question. I appreciate that question because that is a big, big part of looking at, now it's a cultural delusion, but we also have to look at the culture they come from. And with any client, looking at, all right, if I lead them in this way, is it against their culture? But the biggest thing that I do when I'm working with these is I tie the aggression or whatever they may be socializing to their symptoms. So if they're having anger outbursts, I'll talk to them about when was the first time you got really angry? When was the first time you experienced that anger and you hit somebody or whatnot? And have them trace back to the early years, and if they are young, to think about that. And where did they see that was okay? How do they know that it's okay to hit somebody? And they'll tell you, oh, well, this is something that, you know, my parents told me to do in the instance that somebody hits me first, or that I'm to stand up myself. I was raised that way. And that's where you begin exploring, because you have to get to the core of the issue of what leads to the anger and aggression and the outburst today. Does that make sense? Does that help sort of, we could process that for a little bit, but does that make sense?
I will see if Gladys responds. Oh, she did. She said, yes, thank you. So it does make sense.
Okay, good.
I do have a couple of more questions.
Great.
Yeah, and I hope I'm saying them right. Dr. Prasanta is asking if there's any treatment difference in male and female.
Treatment difference as far as mental health in general or the specific disorders that I've talked about?
I will present that question and see if we get a clarification.
Okay.
But other than that, I will check on the clarification. Other than that, there are currently no other questions.
Okay. So while you wait on that, I'll play the video so they can see this, and then we will go back to her question, his or her question.
What, Andrew?
Why did I call your name? Because of the disease. He's very, unstable. Holy! Just leave me alone, everybody!
He's very angry, very hateful towards us. Okay, calm down.
No! He is so deprived of nutrients that he's deranged. He gets violent, and sometimes he'll get physical.
Why don't you go ride your bike and just pull off? Oh. He's so angry. It's really scary.
He doesn't realize how sick he is and how at risk he is, and his health is failing. His heart is arrhythmic. His kidneys are in danger of failing.
I'm gonna popcorn.
He's really in danger of his body just failing and giving out.
He's going to die from this eating disorder. It's going to kill him. I told my husband that I'm so afraid of the next phone call that he gets, that it's going to be that his son is dead. I'm going to lose my son.
So it's a really, I would highly suggest people watch the full episode again. Andrew, I think it was from February 2012. Google search it. You should be able to watch it there. If not, it's on iTunes. You could download and pay for it, but I believe you can find it free on either YouTube or somewhere. But when you see his body, he's bone. Very, very, I mean, completely meets that criteria for anorexia. So it's affecting our boys, our adolescent males, our adult males. So these things are very, very prevalent, and we need to be much more aware that these things are happening. And Natasha, did you get a response back?
I did. So I have the 2 more questions, and then after that, if there are any questions, we will address them at ceu@sovhealth.com. But she did clarify, so Dr. Prasanta asks if there's a difference in female and male treatment of eating disorders.
For the most part, it's the same thing. So the goal would be, depending on if they have bulimia, if they have anorexia, you'll see in this video that, hospitalization, he ends up in the hospital, cardiac arrhythmia, a lot of that physical sort of treatment is the same. From individuals that I know that treat eating disorders, that's one thing I don't treat, but for those who I know who run centers that treat eating disorders, they treat it exactly the same.
Great, thank you for that answer. And the last question that we'll take today, and the rest will be emailed either directly to Dr. DeFeo or again to our email at c@solvehealth.com. So the last question is, again from Gladys in San Diego, although boys' aggression and culture is important to explore, how do I communicate understanding these ways of coping, but at the same time refrain from normalizing it? Changing social norms seems very challenging.
Yes, it is. It's one of those that's case by case, and I would like to explore more of it. Like if you have case, we could talk offline or talk more in depth about it, because it's a pretty loaded question. What I could say right now with that little bit of information is it's going to be case by case. It's going to be what do they want to see in treatment? What do they want to treat? How do you relate the symptom to the aggressive behavior? What's behind the aggressive behavior? It's so hard to answer that question real quickly, but I would be glad to have an offline conversation with you about it, to where I can ask more questions, you can ask more questions, and we can kind of come to and have more dialogue with more time.
Great, thank you so much. And we did share Dr. DeFeo's email address, so you can email her directly or again email us, and we will forward any further questions. Thank you so much, Dr. DeFeo, for taking the time out of your busy schedule and coming online with us and doing this presentation. It was great.